The development is just growing at this insanely rapid pace, and yet we've got this space set aside and reserved for wildlife habitat.
They sent prairie dogs into a chemical wasteland in Colorado. Not a forest, not a flooded mine. A 20,000-acre patch of dirt outside Denver that had been used to manufacture mustard gas, nerve agent, and enough industrial pesticide that 600 different toxic compounds had been pulled out of the soil. The Army had already spent $2 billion just trying to bury what was done there.
In 1987, I believe, this area was designated as a Superfund site. All those years of producing those chemicals, those pesticides, I mean, it definitely took its toll on the land.
And every expert in the country agreed nothing could live on it again. Then somebody opened the crates and let the rodents go. 5 years later, everything had changed, and nobody on the cleanup team could explain how. The factory that made death. 10 miles northeast of downtown Denver, there used to be a place the government didn't want you to know about. 20,000 acres of high plains, flat and wind-hammered, ringed by chain link and razor wire. No public access, no signage, armed patrols around the clock. This was the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and for 4 decades, it produced some of the most lethal substances ever synthesized on American soil. It started in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. The Army needed a site far enough inland that enemy bombers couldn't reach it, with enough flat ground to build fast. They found what they needed in Commerce City, Colorado, and they took it. 200 farming families were forced off their land overnight. Crops they'd planted that spring were bulldozed into the dirt. A schoolhouse became an officers' club. Almost overnight, the land was converted into one of the largest chemical weapons manufacturing sites in the United States. During the war, the facility churned out mustard gas, nerve agent precursors, napalm, and white phosphorus. When the war ended, the factory didn't close. It pivoted. The Army leased huge sections of the facility to Shell Oil, which used the same infrastructure to manufacture commercial pesticides: aldrin, dieldrin, endrin, chlordane. For 30 years, 2 separate industries ran toxic operations on the same patch of ground. And here's the part the cleanup reports leave out. Neither one gave much thought to where the waste went. Poison in the earth. Where it went was straight into the earth. Millions of gallons of raw chemical runoff were dumped into unlined trenches and open ponds. Basin F alone, a 93-acre pit lined with nothing but a thin layer of asphalt, held over 200 million gallons of liquid waste. In the dry Colorado sun, the liquid evaporated and the chemicals concentrated into a sludge so toxic it killed birds on contact. Below the surface, the poison seeped through the sandy soil and into the groundwater, forming plumes of contamination that crept steadily toward the municipal wells, supplying drinking water to 1.5 million people. And then it got worse. In the early 1960s, the Army tried to solve its waste problem by drilling a hole 12,000 feet straight down into the bedrock and pumping 165 million gallons of toxic liquid into it under extreme pressure. Bury the problem so deep it could never come back. That was the plan. What happened instead is that Denver started having earthquakes. Magnitude 5 in a city that had never recorded seismic activity in its history. The pumping stopped. The earthquakes did not. By the time the EPA got involved in 1987 and officially designated the Rocky Mountain Arsenal one of the worst toxic dumps in America, over 600 distinct chemical compounds had been identified in the soil and water. The land couldn't support life. It couldn't hold water. The system was locked, chemically and biologically and physically, behind military fencing in a state of slow, ongoing poisoning. The Army had built something they could no longer kill and could no longer contain. But there was a secret inside that fence that nobody had noticed yet: the accidental preserve. Here's where it gets strange. For 40 years, the buffer zones around the manufacturing core, thousands of acres of perimeter land that existed purely to keep civilians away from explosions and gas leaks, had been completely untouched. No plowing, no development, no pesticide spraying, no suburban sprawl, while every acre of farmland around Denver was being paved over or plowed under. The Arsenal security perimeter accidentally preserved something irreplaceable: small, scattered patches of native shortgrass prairie, and hidden inside them, colonies of black-tailed prairie dogs that had been quietly surviving completely undisturbed for decades. Nobody planned that. The military's obsession with secrecy had built a nature preserve inside a chemical weapons plant, and those forgotten colonies were about to become the most important detail on the entire 20,000-acre site. The first person to really notice was a biologist working a winter survey in 1986. He looked up into the cottonwoods along First Creek and counted more bald eagles roosting together in one place than anyone in Colorado had recorded in modern memory. The eagles, protected under federal law, had been pulled in by the complete absence of human disturbance, the mature trees, and a steady supply of prey from those surviving prairie dog colonies. He turned in his report, and he had no idea what he had just set in motion. If stories about hidden corners of the natural world quietly rewriting what we thought was possible keep you watching, do me a favor and hit subscribe before the next part. Because what comes next is the part the engineers couldn't explain. The cleanup that failed. Before the biology could start, the chemistry had to be contained, and every early attempt was a disaster. The deep well injection had shaken Denver. When the Army tried to clean up Basin F by excavating the sludge and spreading it out to dry in the open air, wind carried the fumes straight into Commerce City neighborhoods. Residents reported breathing problems and panic. After months of complaints, the Army gave up and kept the mess where it sat. The conventional approaches kept failing because they kept trying to remove the contamination entirely. The volume was simply too large. You couldn't incinerate 17,000 acres. You couldn't truck it all away. So, the strategy shifted. Stop trying to eliminate the poison. Entomb it. Over 15 years, the Army and Shell Oil spent $2.1 billion on the most expensive dirt-moving operation in American environmental history. They scraped the top 10 feet of contaminated soil off the central processing zones and sealed it inside two massive double-line landfills built right on site, where the contamination ran deeper than 10 feet, and in many places it did. They capped it in place under engineered barriers designed to shed every drop of rain away from the buried poison. 5 groundwater treatment plants pumped, filtered, and re-injected the aquifer at up to 1 billion gallons of water per year. The surface was now technically safe. It was also completely dead, compacted, stripped. The heavy machinery that had saved the site from its chemistry had destroyed its biology in the process. The native seed bank was gone. The fungal networks were gone. The soil structure was gone. What remained was flat, hard, lifeless ground that couldn't absorb water, couldn't support roots, and couldn't sustain anything. And it might have stayed that way, scraped clean and sold off in lots to developers, except for what that biologist had found in the cottonwoods 8 years earlier. The fight for the refuge, the Eagle Roost discovery launched a political fight. Audubon societies, the Sierra Club, local activists, they all push the same argument. Federal law protects bald eagles, and federal law had just been triggered. This land should become a refuge, not a subdivision. Congress eventually agreed, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was suddenly handed 15,000 acres of biologically dead dirt and told to make it a working shortgrass prairie. They didn't have the budget, they didn't have the time, they couldn't till and seed at that scale. They needed something that could restructure soil, cycle nutrients, alter vegetation, and build habitat all at once, all on its own. They needed the prairie dogs. The 714. In 1989, managers began the deliberate expansion of the remnant colonies that had survived in the buffer zones, supplemented by a targeted relocation of exactly 714 animals. The breakdown matters. 134 were trapped from unaffected areas inside the arsenal itself. 46 came from a radio tracking study. And the other 534 came from a place nobody would have guessed: volunteers. A grassroots group running prairie dog rescue operations across the Denver metro area would get the call whenever a new strip mall or housing tract was about to break ground on top of a colony. They'd show up with soapy water, flush kits, and live traps, and pull the animals out by hand, sometimes hundreds in a single weekend, sometimes working past midnight under truck headlights to beat the bulldozers in the morning. Those animals, the survivors of suburban Denver's expansion, were ear-tagged, dusted for fleas, and released into prepared burrows across multiple sections of the refuge. The official job description was simple: stabilize the soil. That was it. The rodents did not read the brief. The ground opens. The first surprise came from below. As the colonies expanded, their tunneling didn't just loosen the dirt, it fundamentally restructured the soil. Each burrow system punched channels deep into the compacted earth, creating pathways for rainwater that had previously sheeted off the surface like it was hitting pavement. Now the water soaked in, and as the prairie dogs excavated, they brought mineral-rich material from depth up to the surface, mixing it with organic matter from their waste and from decaying plants around their mounds. Microbial communities that had been crushed out of existence by the cleanup machinery began recolonizing the loosened earth. The soil started cycling nutrients again. The prairie dogs weren't digging holes, they were rebuilding the ground from the inside out. And once the soil started breathing, the chain accelerated. 5 years in, by 1994, when a wildlife biologist named Dean Biggins is walking that stretch of dirt and looking down at what he can't quite believe, the prairie dog colonies have rewritten the visible surface of the arsenal. Prairie dogs are relentless grazers. They clip every plant within sight of their burrows down to almost nothing, not because they're hungry, but because they need clear sight lines to spot coyotes and hawks. That constant trimming suppresses tall grasses and woody shrubs and favors a very specific kind of plant: short, fast-growing, protein-rich. The exact species that vanished from the Front Range when the plows came through. The vegetation around the colonies has shifted dramatically. Patchworks of closely cropped, nutrient-dense plants interspersed with bare ground and taller grass on the edges. Not the weedy, uniform cover that usually colonizes disturbed land. Something older, something that hadn't existed here in decades. And the animals that needed this kind of habitat have already started coming back. Burrowing owls move in first. These small raptors can't dig. They depend entirely on tunnels excavated by other animals. As the colonies spread, thousands of abandoned burrow entrances become available, temperature-regulated nesting cavities protected from weather and most predators. The owls raise their young underground in tunnels engineered by rodents. Mountain plovers come next, ground-nesting birds that need bare, flat, heavily grazed earth to breed. Exactly the terrain prairie dog colonies create. Field studies find that plovers nesting on active arsenal colonies produce physically larger chicks with higher survival rates than plovers nesting anywhere else. The food is better. The habitat structure gives the young better odds. Then the raptors follow the prey. Ferruginous hawks, red-tailed hawks, and the bald eagles, the same species whose discovery in the cottonwoods had triggered the entire refuge designation, return in growing numbers, hunting the prairie dog towns through the long Colorado winters. This is what Dean Biggins is looking at in 1994. The animal that accidentally saved the arsenal is now thriving because of what the arsenal has become, 5 years in, and the cascade is just getting started. The bison come home. Stay with me on this, because the next link is the biggest. In 2007, wildlife managers introduced a herd of wild bison to the refuge. This wasn't a sentimental gesture. It was a calculated move built on the foundation the prairie dogs had laid. Bison are heavy grazers that naturally seek out the kind of short, nutritious forage that prairie dog colonies produce. On the historical Great Plains, the two species operated in a loop. Prairie dogs clipped the grass low and promoted high-protein plants. Bison grazed the taller vegetation on the colony edges and kept it from encroaching. The resulting mosaic maintained ideal conditions for both. At the arsenal, that ancient partnership rebooted almost immediately. The bison gravitated to the prairie dog zones. Their grazing reinforced the open structure the rodents needed for predator detection. Two species that hadn't shared this landscape since before the Civil War were operating as a functional unit, again on top of a sealed, toxic waste dump. But the system the prairie dogs had built was about to be tested by something the engineers couldn't cap, couldn't bury, and couldn't shoot. The invisible enemy, sylvatic plague, carried by fleas caused by the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death in medieval Europe. And it tore through the arsenal colonies 6 times between 1989 and 2002. Each outbreak killed up to 95% of the prairie dogs in the affected zones. Entire colonies would go silent in a matter of weeks, burrows packed with the dead. The mounds quiet for the first time in years. Each time, the chain stalled. The owls lost their burrows. The plovers lost their nesting ground. The raptors lost their prey base. And every gain of the previous 5 years suddenly looked like it could be erased in a single summer. The refuge fought back, first with insecticide dust pumped by hand into individual burrows, 6 acres a day, across a refuge the size of a small city. Then, with something stranger. Biologists developed a peanut butter-flavored vaccine bait engineered to trigger an immune response in any prairie dog that ate it. No catching, no handling. The baits were dyed green, laced with a fluorescent marker that showed up later in the animal's whiskers under UV light, so biologists could confirm who had eaten them, and distributed across the prairie by modified all-terrain vehicles covering 60 acres an hour. Drones would have been faster, but Denver International Airport sits right next door, and the FAA isn't taking calls. So the ATVs it was. This wasn't pest control. This was immunological infrastructure built specifically to protect the biological engine running the entire restoration. Because something was coming that nobody at the arsenal wanted to admit they were planning for. Something that hadn't existed in the wild of North America for nearly 4 decades. The rarest mammal in America. On October 5th, 2015, wildlife managers opened a series of crates in the northeast section of the refuge. Approximately 30 black-footed ferrets stepped out into the dirt. Black-footed ferrets are the rarest mammal in North America. In 1979, the species was declared extinct in the wild, gone, erased. The last known wild population had collapsed, and nobody could find another one. Biologists assumed that was it. Then, in 1981, a ranch dog in Meeteetse, Wyoming, came home with a dead one in its mouth. 18 survivors were eventually located and pulled into a captive breeding program. 18 animals. That was the entire surviving species. Every single black-footed ferret alive on Earth today descends from that group. They eat almost nothing but prairie dogs. A single adult ferret needs between 100 and 150 prairie dogs per year, and they live almost exclusively inside prairie dog burrows. They cannot survive without dense, healthy, plague-managed colonies. Period. That is why the arsenal release was the proof. Not proof that someone had a good idea or wrote a strong grant proposal. Physical proof, measured in burrow density and prey abundance, that the food web had been rebuilt from bare, chemically sterilized ground to a fully functional system capable of sustaining an apex predator. The pyramid was complete. Soil microbes at the bottom, grasses above them, prairie dogs above the grass, raptors and owls above the prairie dogs. And now, at the very top of an ecosystem assembled on top of a buried chemical weapons plant, an animal that the United States government had officially declared extinct in the wild. By 2018, that population of 30 had expanded to roughly 90 individuals, breeding in the wild on ground that had manufactured nerve gas within living memory. The numbers. The refuge today spans over 15,000 acres, the largest urban wildlife preserve in the United States, completely surrounded by the Denver metro area. It supports more than 330 documented species of plants and animals. It receives over 340,000 visitors a year on land that was under armed military lockdown for half a century. The EPA systematically removed nearly 16,000 acres from its list of the most contaminated sites in America, certifying them clean enough for unrestricted public use. 917 of those acres were sold to Commerce City and now hold a high school, a civic center, a professional soccer stadium, and 400 acres of public parks. The cleanup cost $2.1 billion. In some years, this single site consumed up to 80% of the entire Department of Defense environmental cleanup budget. Bigger than any other military remediation project in the country, but the force that rebuilt the living surface, the biological engine that restructured the soil, reshaped the vegetation, attracted the grazers, housed the birds, and fed the predators, was a rodent that weighs about 2 pounds. The burrow did the work. The Rocky Mountain arsenal didn't come back because someone planted a forest or seeded a meadow or trucked in topsoil by the ton. It came back because the right animal was placed into the right conditions at the right time, and the physics of the system did the rest. The prairie dogs didn't know they were rebuilding a food web. The bison didn't know they were reinforcing the rodent's habitat. The owls didn't know they were filling a niche that had been empty for 60 years. None of it was coordinated from above. All of it was inevitable from below, once that first piece was in place. When Dean Biggins knelt in the dirt in 1994 and saw what was happening, he was looking at the early evidence of a system rebuilding itself without anyone's permission. By the time the ferrets came out of those crates in 2015, the proof was complete. The most toxic ground in America had become one of the most alive places left in the West. Not because we overpowered the damage with bigger machines, because we put the right engineer on the job and got out of the way. Sometimes the fix isn't a blueprint, it's a burrow. If you had to pick one species to drop into a damaged piece of land near you, knowing it might rewrite the whole place in 5 years, what would it be? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about quiet animals doing the work nobody else could keeps you watching, hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next one.